Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Riskologists. I'm your host, Andy Haslam, and today I've got the pleasure of being joined by Tom Carey. So Tom, welcome to Riskologists.
Thank you, Andy. Pleasure to be here.
We always ask this question to everyone. How's your podcast game, and have you done anything like this before? Do you listen to them at all? Or?
Well, I suppose by virtue of the fact that you're the first person ever to ask me how is my podcast game, I think that sort of gives the game away, doesn't it? No, it's my first podcast, so I'm a total novice. But I do listen to the odd podcast, I must admit, and something I've gotten more into over the last 6 or 12 months. But looking forward to it. Be sure and go easy on me.
Yeah, we'll keep it all nice and conversational, so it should be fine. As always, we like to kick things off with a bit of a journey to date. So, how you've started in your career, where it's taken you, a bit of a timeline up to this point of recording the podcast today. So fire away.
Okay, so my career started in 1994 when I graduated as a young engineer from University College Dublin. And I suppose, despite the fact that I preferred socializing to studying, I somehow or another managed to get one of only 4 jobs that were given to our final year civil engineering class of over 70, and was put on a plane and came over to London, actually, and started my career with John Sisk, the building contractor. So that was a good start, worked in some really interesting projects. I actually stayed in London, or in the UK at least, for the next 11 years. Worked with Sisk for a while as a site engineer and then as sort of a section manager. I joined McNicholas Construction, or Green Max as you would know them in the UK. I was with them for 7 years, and really, they were some of the most formative years of my career. A contractor who had their own labor force, a lot of their own plant, and managing projects for them as a site manager, project manager, subsequently operations manager. You really got into the cut and thrust of construction, because you were organizing the workforce, you were organizing the plant. We didn't subcontract an awful lot of the work out, and was fortunate enough to work on some fantastic projects, predominantly in the rail and utility sectors. Did some tunneling projects as well, and really, learned my trade, I suppose, as an engineer. But what what I did realize pretty early on was that the technical side of things wasn't really where my interest lay. It was more in the managerial side of things, and that's where I developed my career. But in and around the late 90s, I sort of realized that my engineering degree was taking me so far, but I didn't really have the business acumen to drive my career on to the next level. So I went and I did an MBA and found that very, very helpful and transformative in my own career, in terms of allowing me to see a much bigger picture and to get involved in other aspects of the businesses that I was working in. And I suppose to some extent, helped me understand risk a little bit better, because obviously that's a key part of business management. So I wove that into my role, but was keen to there was a lot of public-private partnerships going on in London at the time, and I was keen to get involved in those sorts of projects. So after 7 really excellent years, I left McNicholas Construction and joined John Lang PLC and worked on a portfolio of rail PPP projects. That was really interesting. We might come back to that, because that was my first exposure to risk management, been done really, really well and really comprehensively. But I returned to Ireland in 2005. There was a lot happening in Ireland at the time, and I was offered a role in the public sector to head up the commercial and contracts team for a portfolio of light rail projects in Dublin. For those of you that have been to Dublin, you'd be familiar with the Luas light rail system. So we were building a number of extensions to that. We were also bringing forward an underground metro in Dublin at the time. So that was a big role and too good to turn down. So I came back to Ireland and spent 9 years in a very challenging but very fulfilling role, delivering major projects in the light rail sector in Ireland. Then I spent a couple of years with Dublin Airport in a pretty similar role. I was head of project controls there, getting, I suppose, a flavour for a slightly different sector in terms of aviation and those sorts of projects and all the restrictions that go with them. I toyed for a while with changing career, would you believe. I had, I suppose, developed an interest in contracts and disputes, and I had done a postgraduate in arbitration and law by that stage. I had joined the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. So I went back to college to study law, and was contemplating changing career and becoming a barrister. I subsequently didn't go all the way with that, completed the law degree all right, but decided to combine my engineering and construction management with the law, and that's what I've been focusing on since. So I went back into the private sector in 2017, spent a couple of years with an international infrastructure services business. And then just about 4 years ago, I joined my current employer, which is Turner & Townsend, who I had worked with for a number of years, particularly in the public sector. They were one of our advisors on Metro in Dublin in particular. And so, you know, I've had a great opportunity with them to head up the advisory business in Ireland, working on some of the biggest and most exciting projects in Ireland. And we're currently looking to expand our advisory services now across Europe. So, you know, I suppose it scares me to say that it's been a 28-year career to this point in time, because that seems like an awful long time, and you just realize how bloody old you are. But nonetheless, you know, I've been fortunate to have worked for contractors on the client side with 2 different organizations, and now in consultancy. So the dark art of consultancy, I finally gave into it, and that takes us up to date.
Also, it's an incredible sounding career with such a varied experience in all these different sectors. So it's, you know, your insight is going to be invaluable. So thanks for the run through of that one, Tom. But before we kind of get stuck into the topic in a little bit more detail, and after all, this is a risk management podcast. I think you touched on it very briefly just then, but you know, what's your experience been with risk management over your career, and you know, what sort of relationship have you had with it?
I suppose, look, in the perhaps the first decade of my career, and not because I was working with contractors predominantly, but I suppose risk management was something that we did, but not to a very comprehensive level. We would have had risk registers, and particularly as the NEC form of contract started to come to the fore in the 90s, obviously that drove better project management practice and the need to have early warning registers, risk registers, and stuff like that. But you know, it would have been used to manage and to mitigate risks. It wouldn't have been particularly comprehensive. Up until the point that I joined John Lang PLC, and as I said, you know, we had a portfolio of PPP projects which John Lang themselves were investing in. They were the developer of these projects quite often. And as you'll appreciate, and your listeners will appreciate, you know, when you're putting your own money into something, particularly a construction project, it sheds a different focus, or creates a different focus. So the need to absolutely understand the risks associated with these projects when we were developing the business cases in the early stages of developing these PPP projects was an absolute must. And I suppose it's where, you know, John Lang PLC had a specialist risk consultancy business that worked for them. And as I got involved in various projects, I, you know, was involved with these consultants, doing workshops, producing both cost and schedule risk analysis, quantitative cost schedule risk analysis. And, you know, it was a real eye opener. It was a real eye opener. Wow, you know, this is a different level. And so, you know, what I would say is that ever since then, I've taken that with me for the rest of my career, particularly, you know, working on the client side, working on major projects on the client side. You know, the need to do QRAs, the need to do good risk management. It's something that I've been a huge advocate of ever since. You know, I have developed risk management expertise within all the organizations that I've been in ever since, and you know, embedded QRAs within those organizations. No doubt something that we'll come back to. So, you know, I suppose I think when it's done properly, risk management and QRAs in particular, you know, I can tell you for sure from experience that it can be a game changer for projects, in terms of the certainty with which you can plan your project, and also the certainty of outcome with regard to timelines and budgets and stuff like that. And there's a couple of examples, no doubt, that we might touch on later on in the discussion. But yeah, so and that applies, that need for risk management and that benefit of risk management, in my experience, applies across a broad range. I've implemented it on multi-billion euro rail projects. I've implemented it on IT projects, implemented it on much smaller scale infrastructure and building projects, and sometimes there's a cut your cloth to suit your measure type approach needed. But yeah, it is that's how my relationship with risk management has evolved to being a real advocate of it, and seeing the huge benefits that it can bring when done properly.
Exactly. I think that's a good point to end it on there, is when it's done properly. Kind of getting into the topic that we've got for today. So as everyone can probably tell from the title of the episode, today we're going to be discussing QRA, and namely, is it worth it? Or is it worth the risk? Sorry, I should say. We'll go into this in a little bit more detail shortly, but from your perspective, I think you've slightly touched on it already. Why did you choose this topic in particular? We discussed, I think, before this podcast, a few different points, but is there anything that it made it in particular something to focus on for today?
Yeah, I suppose, look, I've gone into organizations where they have done risk management, but to be honest with you, it has been very much a tick box exercise. The production of a risk register is obviously very good practice from a project management point of view, but you can take it so much further. And I suppose people often struggle with, well, at the extreme, you get project managers perhaps that don't like that the hassle of having to put together risk registers and mitigation plans and different things like that, and managing and monitoring that, because it's it requires a level of discipline and time and stuff like that, and the whirlwind of the day job sometimes makes it seem difficult to fit these things in. But so you get the reaction that, oh, I'm managing risk all the time, I don't need to write it down, I'm managing it. But of course, we all know that you do need to write it down, because you need people to help you manage risk, and you need to have a common shared understanding of what the risks are in a project, and most importantly, what the mitigation measures are, and have those mitigation measures in place and agreed with the team. Then you get some people who do risk registers and faithfully produce risk registers and put in mitigation measures and stuff like that, but they see that as the sum total of their job, and they sort of feel if they've got a risk register and it's been updated once a week or once a month or whatever it is, depending on the size and scale of the project, that they've done their job. And they often find it difficult to go, well, why would I spend more time and effort on doing quantitative risk analysis? But I suppose that's why we've got this topic, is it worth it? And I would say it absolutely is worth it in the right circumstances. The benefit that you get out of doing that forensic analysis of risk and detailed assessment of the time and cost impacts of the risks that you've identified, and you can link that into your schedule, you can link that into your budget, you all of a sudden have a far more robust view of your project. You have a much better handle on how you're going to manage your project and what needs to be done to make it successful. And because those things are in place, then you vastly increase the probability of having a successful outcome and getting the project team behind you in achieving that. So I suppose, the title is appropriate, because some people might be sitting there going, oh, QRA, that sounds very complicated, I need specialists and stuff like that. Is it for me? And depending on the size and complexity of your project, I would say that it absolutely is, and something that that people should take that leap of faith and get into QRAs, because the benefits are significant.
Brilliant. Cheers for that, Tom. So I'm sure the majority of our listeners will already have some understanding of what QRA is. However, for the benefit of anyone listening who doesn't, quantitative risk analysis, or QRA, is basically a tool which is used in the risk profession to assess confidence across cost and schedule objectives. So it helps to provide insights into where a project or a business may be particularly vulnerable. And so we can then focus our attention on those areas. So for Tom, you've already mentioned about how you come across this thing called QRA, but did you have any preconceptions or expectations at the start of your journey with it?
I suppose not particularly. It was pretty new to me, Andy, to be honest with you. So I suppose I'd like to think that I had an open mind. I'm sure at some point I was saying, who the hell is this guy and what is he doing? Or what, why are we going through all this rigmarole? And sometimes, you have to bear with it. And when you see the output, and then, I mean, the thing that struck me on the PPP projects that I was working on with John Lang was that we did QRAs regularly. So it wasn't a one-off thing for the purposes of the business case. Yes, it was, but it also then was a continuous process of revisiting, perhaps on a quarterly basis, our risk exposure. And the great thing then from a project contract management point of view was that you could see that you were effectively managing risk because you were constantly reducing your exposure. And, you need to do a quantitative risk analysis to be able to quantify your risk exposure, whether that be time risk or cost risk. So, by the time you get on to iteration 3, 4, 5, and you can start to see the risk journey that you're going on, and it's a great one for, particularly for stakeholders and for boards and stuff like that, that you can go and say, look, we're managing risk effectively on this project by virtue of the fact that we are reducing our exposure. And sometimes it goes up, sometimes things happen and the risk profile might go up, but you can explain that too, but at least you're managing it. So I don't think I had any preconceptions, but whatever they were pretty quickly dispelled by a really good risk consultant who produced good quality outputs that we had a lot of confidence in because of the time and effort that went into producing the outputs. And as I said, that repetition then to see the progress of mitigating and managing risk effectively was invaluable.
Mm-hmm. So in your opinion, how do you measure the value of risk management with and without QRA then? I mean, do you feel that risk management maturity has improved because of it?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, I suppose, if you look at the environment that we're in now, compared to, let's say, 15 or 20 years ago, the need to be able to demonstrate, be transparent with a broad range of stakeholders on a project that you are managing this project effectively. Really good quality risk management is a really important tool in that respect. I mean, I'm currently advising the Irish government on as a peer review on some of the major projects that we're bringing forward in Ireland. And we have, in Ireland at least, we have introduced a sort of a major projects advisory peer group that give assurance to government that these projects are ready to be brought forward to the next stage. Mm. And I can tell you now that risk management and the approach that those projects have adopted to risk management, have they got good quality registers? Have they done schedule risk analysis? Have they done cost risk analysis? They're the questions that we're asking. Mm-hmm. And, that wouldn't have happened 10 or 15 years ago. So I definitely think people are beginning to realize that, there's value in this, and managing your risk is a key part of having a good project. Obviously there's the Brent Flybergs of this world and that have sort of popularized good risk management and what have you. But I think it's definitely maturing, particularly on the area that I'm most familiar with, which is infrastructure projects. Mm-hmm. And major infrastructure projects. Undoubtedly, we've come a long way. And, in fairness to the UK authorities, there's a lot of excellent work being done by various different groups there. I'm thinking of the major projects. Is it major projects group or major projects advisory. Apologies, I don't know the name properly, but I think who I'm talking about. The process that they have around what does good project management look like. Risk management is at the heart of it.
No, I mean it's kind of leads on to a question that we'd come up with here, which was we've seen have you seen a correlation then where with successful projects, or the success of a project, I should say, and or organizations that have worked to really kind of embrace risk management and QRA as opposed to those who haven't?
Yeah, I mean, I could give you so many stories where it's made a difference. Picking the right one is. Let me give you one good example. I went into an organization that had a pretty basic risk management approach. There was risk registers done and stuff like that, but it was really a tick box exercise. And they certainly hadn't done quantitative risk analysis at all. Hadn't even heard of it. The risk person sort of, didn't really understand what it was. And they had this repeated problem in that they came up with budgets at the start of their financial year for their capital projects, but they invariably never spent it. Okay, so they might have gone and looked for, let's say, 200 million in a particular year for their capital projects, of which there might have been 60 or 70 individual projects, some big, some small. And over the course of the year, they would constantly write down that budget because they weren't delivering the projects on time. They were getting delayed predominantly. And this was a source of huge frustration to this organization, as you might imagine. They were setting aside this capital, which they viewed could be used elsewhere for these things, and they weren't being used. So when I went in there, we introduced QRA, and when we went to set the budget for the next year, we developed a high-level schedule for all of these projects, and we didn't have to go into a huge amount of detail, because some projects were at a very early stage of maybe feasibility or even early design stages. So we didn't always have a great understanding of the scope, but we had enough of information to be able to put together a high-level schedule for each of those projects, put that into a master program, and then we spent a couple of days, well, not successively, but a couple of workshops, probably all in all a couple of days realistically, going through each of the projects, understanding what the main risks might be to the delivery of that project. And some of it was definition issues, some of it was development of design, some of it was constraints that might prohibit construction. Obviously, I don't want to give the game away, but this was in an airport environment, so there was a lot of interface or interplay between projects. If you were doing one project in this part of the airfield, then obviously you couldn't do it in another part. So all of this needed to be contemplated in terms of the risks. And we did a comprehensive piece of work on that. And at the end of it, we came up with a risk-adjusted schedule for the 70 or 80 projects for that year. And because we had cost-loaded the schedule, we came up with a revised spend profile for the year based on the risk-adjusted schedule. And if I remember rightly, just to give you broad figures, and it doesn't matter, but I think that particular year we're looking for 150 million. By the time we'd finished the QRA exercise, we had written it down to something like 115. That was the practical, what we felt was achievable on a risk-adjusted basis, right? That financial year, we spent 114.7 million or something ridiculous.
Wow.
It was so close to it, it was unreal. And to this day, and they've kept that model, but I don't know necessarily if they've applied the same rigor. But people were just delighted with it in the sense that we got the thing so much more realistic because we had made a risk adjustment and we'd put hard work into it. It wasn't just, okay, let's come up with a few risks for this project or that project. We went into it in depth, brought in the people that knew what they wanted to deliver and discussed it, identified the risks, and then worked that through a QRA on the schedule. So, the proof is in the pudding. I could give you several other examples, but there's a really good one.
No, it's fascinating. It's impressive to see that it's actually done what it's supposed to be doing, and it's been so valuable to that particular client. So it's a really great insight for it. I mean, we touched on a little bit before, or you mentioned before that QRA is one of those things that it's almost particular to your business, whether it's going to work or it's particular for that project. But what level do you feel it's worthwhile conducting a QRA to really realize that benefit?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question and a difficult one, as you'll appreciate, I'm sure, to answer, because you could sort of try and come up with a notional value, and you could say, well, you would only do QRA and projects over 5 million or
Yeah.
10 million or something like that, right?
Hmm.
But I think that doesn't do it justice, because I have worked on some extremely complex projects that are potentially lower in value, that might be in and around that 5 million threshold, but because of the nature of the project, it could be an IT project, or it could be a construction project, but with a lot of moving parts, a lot of interfaces. So I think that's a bit of a judgment call. But I suppose if you were to try to apply some sort of rule of thumb, you can, the thing about it is, in my experience, is you can do QRA light. Like, I mean, you can, the level of analysis and risk that you go into is really, you cut your cloth to suit your measure. If you've got a 5 million project, it doesn't mean you can't do a QRA in it.
Hmm.
It just means that you probably don't have a risk register that's got 200 risks on it,
Hmm.
perhaps. Right. Your schedule is not going to be a 4 or 5 year schedule that's really complex with a lot of different interfaces that you need to manage and correlation of risks and stuff like that. But it can still be effective, and it can be done much quicker for simpler projects. So, my thing would be, do it if you can, no matter what the size of the project, and certainly anything over 5 million, I think you should be seriously considering doing it. But that's just based on my own experience.
Yeah, it's definitely a case of horses for courses, I think, is,
Absolutely.
to use another expression for it. But yeah, it's
Yeah,
definitely, it's good to hear that it's relevant on the smaller projects as well as the bigger ones.
I think so.
Um, so kind of moving on from that, so from a modeling perspective, I kind of believe there's a couple of extremes, when it comes to modeling. Kind of one side of the coin is someone who knows how to use the software and run the analysis, but there isn't much in the way of challenging the inputs and providing insight on the outputs. So a bit more of just like a handle cranker, if you will. On the other side, there are those who are exceptional modelers. However, they kind of lack the ability to translate those outputs in a way which is, the layperson can understand, and they kind of revert to jargon. So things like correlation coefficients and convergence, for instance. From your perspective, what makes a good risk modeler, and what's worked best for you in your career?
Yeah. I mean, if you don't mind, Andy, I'd like to sort of widen the question out to say
Yeah,
what
yeah.
makes a good risk manager, because I think that the modeling obviously is the finessing of the input almost. So for me, and I've seen some really excellent risk managers, risk modelers, risk consultants,
Mhm.
and I've seen some average ones too, in fairness. But the important thing is if they're prepared to learn and improve. But so the art of risk management, I think, first of all, I think you need to be good at facilitating workshops. So having the ability to get a group of people together, and in a controlled but safe environment for people to feel free to speak their minds, to have a meaningful workshop, to explore risks, to brainstorm risks. That's the starting point. And I think that skill is really underestimated, because it's not that easy to go into a room of strangers. Sometimes you might know one or two people. You could have 10 or 12 people in the room. They might not all get on with one another.
Mhm.
Some of them might be dominant, some of them might be quiet. And to be able to facilitate a workshop in that environment, and to actually draw all the risks out of everybody, because everybody has something to contribute. And it's probably the person that's been quietest that actually might have sometimes the greatest insight, or be thinking about a risk that nobody else is thinking about, that's really important to the delivery of the project. So that's skill number one, and that's something that is comes with experience, and seeing how other people have done it. I think then what is often required after the initial workshops is a lot of follow up and a lot of perseverance in terms of really getting under the skin of risks. So you'll often get a sort of an initial stab at what the risk means, what you might, what the impact of it might be, what the mitigation measures might be. But in a brainstorming session, you'll want to quickly capture the risk, and maybe capture some of the information around the mitigation measures or the impacts, but move on, because you want to continue that flow. So after the workshop, the follow-up is important in talking to the individuals and talking to the team and getting those risks really nailed so that there's a really good understanding of it, a clear understanding of it, you know, a good understanding of the impacts, a good understanding of the mitigation. And this is all leading up to having a really rich risk register with, you know, a good description of the risk, a 3-point estimate for the cost impact, potentially a 3-point estimate for the schedule impact, an understanding of what activities within the schedule this risk impacts, and it's often more than one activity, it's not just one, and if there's correlation issues. So developing that really good quality risk register that you're then going to use your model on is the secret to it. And you know, we've all heard the expression rubbish in, rubbish out, right? So you need to be, as a risk manager, risk modeler, you need to have that perseverance, you need to have that tenacity to be able to go and talk to people that haven't got the time to talk to you, but nonetheless you need that information because this is your baby, this is the thing that you're going to model, and you want it to be right, you want it to be as accurate as possible. And then obviously, you know, to have an understanding of the modeling software, to have an understanding of how risk can impact, particularly on schedule. I think, you know, the fact that risks may impact on multiple activities, or you may have activities that have multiple risks. The ability to be able to navigate and to have a discussion with the project team about what risks are correlated. So what risks, you know, if one happened, the other one couldn't happen, so that you don't end up with a situation where you're double counting risk almost. So that's a really important aspect of it, particularly at the QSRA, the quantitative schedule risk analysis level. And then, you know, I think another really important skill is to be able to present the information in a meaningful manner. So not to make it overly complicated, but nonetheless to be able to present the data, you know, the range of probabilities of outcome from P10 up to P90 or whatever it is, however you're presenting them. Understand where the client is at in terms of their governance. Do they use P50? Do they use P80? Or you know, looking at standard deviations so that you can help them appreciate what sort of variance there is in the outcomes at the different probability levels. And then, you know, it's quite often an iterative process. It's not a case of the first time you do it and the first model output is the final one. Even in, you know, you would normally have to go back and maybe fine tune it, because you might, not that you don't like the outcomes, but it might be throwing up some anomalies or whatever. And maybe when you sit down and you've got the modeling, the first pass of the modeling complete, that it's a good opportunity to sit down with the project team and go through it and fine tune things a little bit. And then, you know, to be able to present that back, to be able to present it to the project team, or even to perhaps more senior people. And, you know, in my experience, when you do present that back in a very concise and meaningful way, and people see the level of effort and detail that you've got into, it creates a huge level of confidence in the project. And, you know, then the proof is in the pudding in terms of how accurate it becomes subsequently, you know, in terms of bringing projects within budget, bringing them on time, which is obviously always a challenge. So I think, you know, there's the role of the risk modeler, the role of the risk manager is multifaceted, and it's not an easy job, but you know, those skills can be acquired. You don't have to be good at everything. Some people can be good facilitators, some people can be good modelers, and obviously, you know, people are working to those that have good facilitative skills working on their modeling, perhaps, and vice versa. So, you know, it's all part of the journey, isn't it?
No, definitely. Well, thanks for that, Tom. Moving on really again. So we've mentioned really about the benefits of the positive side of QRA and how it benefits a lot of organizations and projects and things. So to kind of flip and go to a bit of a devil's advocate, you know, with this one, do you think there's a potential that we put too much faith in QRA sometimes? You know, you've already touched on the fact that sometimes it's based on the inputs being there, and the old adage, and, you know, garbage in, garbage out springs to mind.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I suppose there is a risk, pardon the pun, to putting too much faith in QRAs, for sure. I suppose maybe two ways of thinking about it. First of all, you know, even before you do a QRA, you've created a pretty good risk register to enable you to do it. And hopefully some of your listeners will appreciate that in order to do a schedule risk analysis, a quantitative schedule risk analysis, you really have to have a lot of discipline in your schedule. So logic links all have to be in order for the risk model to actually work. So there's two things in that. You get a really good risk register and a good understanding of your risks. Hopefully you've developed mitigation measures and you understand the impacts. So even before you do the modeling, you've got a huge sort of head start on really managing your project much better and getting a much better handle on managing your project. The fact that then that you've got to go and make sure that your schedule is fit for a QRA requires a level of discipline in the schedule, and fixing illogical links or no links at all is a really good cleanup of the schedule, and often throws out some challenges in its own right. So there's two things that you've benefited from, and you haven't even run the model yet. Okay. When you run the model, then yes, I suppose I would have a lot of faith in QRAs because I've seen it and been party to doing it well, and have had the benefit of hindsight in, as I described in the instance of the annual budget, but also in terms of QSRAs we did on really long projects where the deterministic end date was, I don't know, in 2 years' time. The P80 end date was in 3.5 years' time, and we ended up delivering the project in 3 3/4 years or something like that. So the benefit of it. But I suppose it does need that level of diligence and detail in the inputs to make sure that the output is right. What you can do then, and we touched on it earlier, is that you can continuously update your QRA. So it's not a one-off thing. If you see it as a one-off thing, I think then at some point in time, those outputs are going to look maybe inaccurate or less relevant than they were at the time. So the continuous process of whether it's quarterly or half yearly or monthly, if you've got the budget and the inclination to do it, you're constantly updating both your schedule and cost risk, and you're updating your budget, you're updating your key milestones in your program. So I think that helps in terms of, don't put faith in one number, but keep an eye on it and see how it evolves. And if you adopt that really detailed and diligent approach to the development of the register and getting your schedule right, you've gained something. And if you continuously do your QRA, I think the level of certainty then that you can have in the outputs and the confidence you can have in the outputs, are there, and you don't need to be worried about putting too much faith in it.
I mean, you just mentioned that obviously about the to get the best out of it and to have faith in what's going into it. It relies on good inputs to it being the risk register, and then also with a decent schedule. Considering that approach to ensure that there is a valid inputs to the QRA, have you had any kind of experience that in how best to do that, how best to get the best inputs into it to get the most out of the QRA?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one mistake or oversight that sometimes happens is that there are not enough of people, or not a broad enough range of people, that are involved in the original risk identification part of the journey, whether that be the brainstorming workshops or the one-to-ones to understand the risks. The last thing that you want is to produce your risk register, do your QRA modeling, and then for somebody to come in and go, oh, you didn't think about this, or you didn't consult me, or you didn't think about that. So I think, to validate the inputs, you do need a broad range of people. You need the technical people, you need the commercial people, you might need the legal people, you might need the planning people, you obviously need the risk people, the project manager. There will be other stakeholders that it's probably no harm to have in the room. And there's all sorts of side benefits from doing this. It's not just about getting to an accurate budget or an accurate schedule, excuse me. There is an element of team bonding that you get out of these sessions. There's an element of shared understanding of what the project is about and what the risks are in the project that have huge benefits as you start to deliver that project. So I would say that a key thing is to make sure that enough of people from a diverse range of skill sets and technical parts of the project, or disciplines, professions, contribute at an early stage, because then you will have greater confidence that you've covered all of the risks, and the inputs will be much more accurate for it. It may be a case that some people, while they'll be able to tell you about the risk, might struggle to quantify it. They might go, well, what's the likely impact of that in terms of cost or time? And they might really struggle with that. So that's okay. You can park that, and maybe you can sit down with the project manager and the commercial people at a later point, and they can figure it out, and they can come up with some sort of a formula or a method of calculating the minimum, most likely, and maximum impacts on cost and schedule. But I think the other thing is, I suppose, is to get in terms of validating the inputs, is just to get somebody maybe from another project to come in and have a peer review of it. We would quite often start the risk process for a project with looking at a previous project. What were the risks that were on the previous project? Or looking at a lessons learned report from a similar project will often be a rich source of information and risks, which can give you that confidence that the inputs that you're putting in are valid, because this has happened before, and this is the lessons that the last project gave us. So they're all things to consider to make it better.
Yeah, I think it's a lot there for the listeners to take away from it. They'll hopefully get the best out of the QRA for them, because it's all invaluable information there. Just kind of wrapping things up then a little bit on the topic. Organizations that we've dealt with in the past can vary in terms of what they want from a QRA, in terms of knocking up a 50-page report, or some are happy just to do it on a page or two. In your opinion, what are the key outputs from a QRA that have helped you make decisions?
Yeah, I think that we touched on it earlier on. So the one of the most important things is to get the range of outcomes at the probability intervals. So let's just take a quantitative cost risk assessment. More often than not, an organization is going to use that to inform their risk allowance or contingency within their budget. And it's really for that organization and for them to decide what their risk appetite is. So understanding from a probability of 10% up to 90% is an important output, and they can then pick P50 or P80, and some organizations are pretty prescriptive about it.
Yeah.
So that's undoubtedly a key output. Another key output is obviously the top 5 or top 10 risks. The model will tell you what the top risks are, what is having the greatest impact on your overall risk number. So understanding those risks, because they're the ones that you need to work the hardest on, arguably. And that tornado graph, for those of your listeners who's familiar with it, that sort of graphically illustrates what risks are having the biggest impact on the overall figure, the overall output. So I think that's really useful. And perhaps the third thing then is, if you're in the space of, this isn't your first rodeo and you're doing successive QRAs, there's a really nice visualization of your risk exposure that can be done. And I think that's really, really helpful in terms of proving that the work that you're putting into your risk management is paying off, and that you're reducing your exposure to risk. So yeah, it doesn't need to be a 50-page report. I mean, I think the body of the report can be 5 to 10 pages, perhaps not even that. A couple of key tables, a couple of key graphs. Obviously, you're going to put a lot of stuff in the appendix, the full risk register and stuff like that. But in my experience, those 3 things are probably the most important.
No, it's excellent. Again, it's another key valuable piece of information and experience from you that I think everyone can really take away from that. So that really kind of brings us to the end of the topic. But as we get towards the end of the podcast, and all our regular listeners will know that at this point we tend to ask our guests the question: if you could give yourself one piece of advice at the start of your career that you may have picked up along the way, that what would it be? And it doesn't need to be QRA related.
Yeah. I suppose one of the things, and maybe it's a personal thing, but I'll share it with you nonetheless. I think that doing a bit of work in terms of trying to understand yourself is really, really important. And I say that in the context of the relationships that you will have with people over the course of your career, whether they be people that you're managing, people at your own level or grade, or those that are managing you and your seniors. And I suppose it probably took me quite a while for the penny to drop. As you might appreciate, I started off my career working in the cut and thrust of construction, and particularly in Greenmax. I alluded to the fact that we had our own workforce. So you were, I don't know if motivating is the right word, but you were managing a workforce on the ground, and they weren't professionals as such, but they were great at their job and stuff like that. But it was pretty gruff. There wasn't a lot of political correctness, and nobody was using pronouns or anything like that. But so then to move into a more professional sort of arena, when you get into on the client side, and even at the higher levels in a contracting organization, and you're dealing with a broader range of stakeholders, a broader range of colleagues from different functions, finance and marketing and stuff like that. That's when your interpersonal relationships with them and your ability to work with those diverse range of people who will all have different personalities, different perspectives, that it can be, it can be probably quite easy for some, it can be challenging for others. And I think the key to unlocking that is to start by understanding yourself. So if I was to give myself a little bit of advice, it would have been to probably put a book or two in front of me and make me read them at a much younger age. I'm particularly thinking about things like The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, Win-Win, all of that sort of stuff. I think that it pays huge dividends. So your ability to get on with people, and in order to do that, you need to understand yourself before you try to understand others. But I think no matter what walk of life you're in, the ability to, and you don't have to get on with everybody, as in you don't have to be best friends with them. You just have to learn how to work with them and get the best out of them and get the best out of it together. So I think that would be the best piece of advice at the start of your career. I don't think it was focused on much when I was a young graduate. Perhaps they do focus it on more now in universities, but certainly don't underestimate what is needed. And I think particularly for the male cohort on the call, there's a lot of research that's been done now that has helped to understand that males mature much later than females from an emotional intelligence point of view. And sometimes it's well into their 30s, sometimes into their 40s before, and maybe helped by having a family or something like that, that they become a bit more considerate and a bit more thoughtful about understanding themselves and understanding others. So that would be something that would be would be my advice for what it's worth.
No, it's really insightful, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. I think it's I'd pass that on to myself at a younger stage as well. So yeah, I'd have to agree massively with that one. I mean, that really does bring us to the end of the podcast. So it only leaves me to thank you, a great deal, Tom, for your time and your valuable insights today. So, bringing us to the end of it, if any of the listeners want to contact you regarding this episode or anything else with it, how's the best way for them to reach out for you?
Yeah, well, listen, thanks very much for having me. I've really enjoyed it, and
it's a pleasure.
Yeah, I hope that your listeners get something from it. Yeah, look, Tom Carey, I work for Turner & Townsend in Ireland, so anybody will get me on LinkedIn. If you want to drop me an email, it's tom.carey@turntown.com. But yeah, probably LinkedIn is the best way to reach out to me. So I look forward to hearing from some of your listeners.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, thanks again, Tom. It's been an absolute pleasure. So, but everyone, thanks for listening, and we'll be back with an episode soon.
Great. Thank you, Andy.